Never noted theme of American foreign policy is that it is always the Christians who suffer. 9 out of 10 of them are no longer there. They're gone. That was an effect of our foreign policy. If you wake up in the morning and decide that your Christian faith requires you to support a foreign government blowing up churches and killing Christians, I think you've lost the thread.
What's going on, everybody? I'm excited. I got Dave Smith. It's someone I've been wanting to talk to for years. I'm glad it's happening. So, Dave, thank you for being here. Appreciate you.
Oh, thank you, brother. Thanks for having me. And likewise, this is long overdue.
Yeah, so it's good timing. It's interesting timing. And I want to talk about a lot of stuff in general, but we're going to start it off with a few clips from Tucker Carlson. He put out a controversial piece about Christians in Israel. And I think that this is front and center, not just geopolitically because of the wars, not just in America, because hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars are going to Ukraine, mostly in Israel now, but also in conservative media. There's been a huge kind of separation between people who perceive certain things as hateful and too far and others who perceive it as a long time coming and just a conversation that they've been trying to have. So it's going to be a great chat. Just to let you guys know, give me a thumbs up in the chat if everything's good. Dream Rare Podcast starts now.
It's the Dream Rare Podcast. Welcome to the show. The way to get the news at the desk or on the road. Let's go. God is great and success in our control. The world is crazy, but we get better from obstacles. Yeah.
So that's what it's about today. But I want to say, Dave, real quick, I think a lot of people respect you and find you as super genuine. Anybody I ever talk to, they always have good things to say about you. So it's great to chat. And that's how I feel when I see your stuff. I'm like, this guy, never see you lying, never see you doing anything unreasonable. So, I appreciate your perspective.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very much. I'm a stand-up comedian, and I've been doing stand-up comedy for like 16 years now. And when I first started, as was typical at the time, my management used to always send me out to acting auditions, and I can tell you quite confidently, like, I am the worst actor on the face of the planet. I never got anything. I was terrible in auditions, and I hated it so much. I eventually was just like, stop sending me on these because I can't act and I don't want to. But so yeah, whatever you see from me, that's really me. That's how I feel. I'm not capable of acting if I wanted to.
I never got into that, but I always found it creepy for my friends because I lived in LA for a while. They said, like, I went in a room, like, say they were Asian and everyone looked exactly like them. And it's like, it's different versions of you. So it like kind of freaks you out. It's like 100 chubby Asian guys for the chubby Asian guy role. And
Yep.
your competition in the world is all right there.
Yeah. And you're like, oh, that guy's so much chubbier and more Asian than me. I'm never going to get this part.
Exactly. And I want to talk about your comedy and come up too, because I think it's interesting how probably, in comedy, you always joked about everything, but it seems like things that people probably were like, don't do that or don't say that. Now it's becoming popular because people are looking for someone to just call it like they see it.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I'll play the first clip and then I want to get your reaction to it. I had to chop it up and speed it up because I'm always getting copyright stricken on Facebook and YouTube. So I would love to play more in context, but I'm just getting the gist of it. It's a 42-minute interview, and Tucker Carlson interviewed, I believe, a Christian leader from Palestine, which is very narrative shifting. And here's just a few clips I found interesting.
A consistent but almost never noted theme of American foreign policy is that it is always the Christians who suffer. So, for example, during the more than a decade the U.S. government spent occupying Iraq, the ancient Christian community of Iraq was completely devastated. 9 out of 10 of them are no longer there. They're gone. Almost never, ever even mentioned by Christian clergy in this country, many of whom supported that war and that occupation. Why is that? A Greek Orthodox church in the Gaza Strip was hit by an airstrike. We're showing the video now. The church is in ruins. At least 17 people were killed that day. And again, that was hardly the first time that fighting in that region killed Christians. You'll remember the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem.
But when you look at the so-called religious right, we receive no sympathy whatsoever. Sometimes we just plead to be heard and to have our perspective taken seriously. Do you know that your lobbying, your positions, even your sermons have direct consequences on our...
So I'll let you just go off as long as you'd like if you saw more of the clip or what you thought about the interview.
Yeah. No, I watched the interview earlier today, and it was very interesting. It's the reaction to it's really fascinating because, of course, anything. I mean, as I'm sure you've experienced, I mean, any type of criticism of Israel, it's like this white hot stove that if you touch it, people all freak out. And people are so trained to immediately think that you must hate Jews. You know, like if you start saying anything about Israel, which is so ridiculous, if you just think about it on its face, I mean, we don't have this reaction with any other government. There's no other government where, like, if you were to criticize, you know, German policy on something, someone would be like, oh, you must like have a hatred of German people. Or it's a very strange thing. I think that the broader point that Tucker made at the beginning there is a very good point. And it does rarely come up. I mean, it's almost never discussed by anyone in the corporate media or anyone in the political class that many of the wars, and he mentioned I don't know if it was in that clip, but in the fuller context, he mentioned not just Iraq, but Syria too, where Bashar al-Assad was a protector of the Christians. And of course, you know, if you think about the part of the region that he's in, Bashar al-Assad is a guy with a shaved beard and a three-piece suit. So by definition, he is a secular moderate comparatively to other leaders in the region. And the U.S. plan for years, going back to at least late 2001, was to overthrow him. And then they put that plan into action in 2012. And what was the reason for that? Well, it certainly wasn't any feeling for what was best for the country, for the people. Certainly, as Tucker points out, was not what was best for the Christians. But it did strategically help Saudi Arabia and Israel. At least that's how they perceived it. And so it's like when you start thinking about things like this, you realize that it's like, oh yeah, okay, they are willing to like screw over Christians in a country or just the people in that country for what? I mean, the United States of America doesn't have any strategic interest in Iraq, Iran, and Syria not being Shiite dominated, but Israel sure does, you know? And so like, then it just leads to all of these other questions. And of course, you know, more specifically here, I don't think most Americans probably don't even know that there are Christians in Palestine. And so it's great. I think that Tucker's kind of bringing these issues to light.
Yeah, I know with you know, they'll say like anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and that's tricky rhetoric because also like it doesn't necessarily mean you're anti something if you say something about it. Like I don't like the pro or anti because I think it's always misframed, but it's like I understand that is the homeland currently. But you know, I don't talk about Ukraine. I know one of the anti-Semitism speech laws they're trying to pass says like if you criticize Israel more than another democratic nation, and I don't talk about Ukraine more than Switzerland because I hate Ukrainians. It just so happens that they're taking a lot of money and fighting this huge war that includes my country's support. So I feel like where a lot of this talk about Israel comes from. And I know the more that they call these things like anti-Semitic, the more people just don't really care about that word. And I think with Tucker having this conversation, it's breaking a lot of paradigms because in the Christian faith, there's a huge discussion and debate also, which I'm sure you're aware of, which is like some people see Zionism as cornerstone to their Christian faith. Others see Israel as, you know, in the hearts of Christians. So, you know, if you don't, I've always said this, and like people have called me anti-Semitic for it. And I'm not even being hateful about it. I'm just like, if you don't understand Zionism, it's hard to understand American foreign policy or even American politics in general, because it's not just Jewish Americans or Jewish Israelis. It's a lot of Christian and Catholic Americans who have a certain worldview of the end times and how they perceive Israel's role in it. And there's nothing you could tell. I'm not getting upset at all. It just literally is what it is. And it's really difficult to talk about because the accusations kind of just pour out at you, and it could be a little annoying and frustrating.
Yeah, that's right. And look, just like with all type of accusations of racism or homophobia, or, you know, like any of the woke accusations, and it's the same thing with the anti-Semitism. It's like there are actually people out there who really are racist, and there are people who really hate Jews. But then what happens is that anybody who criticizes Israeli policy, let's say, or the relationship between the United States and Israel, gets labeled as anti-Semitic, and then it becomes this thing where, as you were kind of getting at, the term loses value. But also, I mean, this was one of the reasons why I was so ferociously defending Candace Owens, is because that you have someone like Candace Owens who and I've watched a decent amount of her stuff, she would bend over backward in every conversation to be explicit that, like, no, I'm not saying Jewish people. I love lots of Jewish people. I've always been very close with Jewish people, nothing against them. I'm not even saying like all the citizens of Israel. I'm specifically talking about this policy of Netanyahu's, this assault on Gaza. And she still gets labeled an anti-Semitic. And when you do that, now it's just like, well, anytime someone tells me, oh, this guy's a Jew hater, I'm just like, I'll figure it out for myself. I can't take your word for it anymore. And so that's one of the second effects of it. Look, I'll say this. John Mearsheimer recently made this point, and John Mearsheimer is, a brilliant world-renowned scholar who I think has been really must-read stuff on Ukraine and Israel. But he put it like this, and I think he's right, that he goes, look, the relationship between the United States of America and Israel is unlike any relationship between two governments in the history of the world. There's really never been anything like it, where Israel gets unconditional, total support from the U.S. And when I say unconditional, meaning that even if they're doing something that the United States does not want them to do, that every single president of my lifetime, with the exception of Donald Trump, who was just awful on Israel. One of the things I like about you is that you keep your integrity when it comes to the topic of Donald Trump. But Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, even Barack Obama, all of them wanted a two-state solution. All of them tried at different points to push Israel to get to a two-state solution. Israel wouldn't do it. The aid was never interrupted at all. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether they're doing what the president of the United States of America wants them to do. They still get more foreign aid than any other country in the world. And that in itself is enough to be like, hey, no, I'm sorry, I get to criticize that. If you're telling me that I'm forced to fund a country, and even if my, the ridiculous mythology of government or whatever it is, but my elected representatives who work for me, their say doesn't matter, and in fact, you'll just give them the middle finger. I mean, Netanyahu's on tape bragging about fooling Bill Clinton, and that doesn't interrupt the aid. That doesn't even make the next president of the United States go, hey, wait a minute. I'm not going to support you if you're bragging about tricking my predecessor. Maybe you're trying to trick me now. Nope. Aid continues. No matter how, just in the last few months, how many times has Blinken and Joe Biden and all these guys been like, hey, we sure would like if you would stop doing what you're doing to the Palestinians. And they go, nope, we're going to keep doing it. We'll take that bomb now, sir. And they go, okay, yeah, here's your bomb. I mean, just that enough is alone to be like, no, you're fair game for criticism. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a wild relationship. And on that note, I actually have this Shapiro tweet, which, I'm not a fan, if anybody knows this on my show, I'm not a fan of the Biden administration. I don't think they're doing a good job. But Ben, and I saw you retweet this as well, it seemed like he was implying that if the aid isn't unconditional and then you're a Hamas, basically a terrorist. And I'll just read the tweet. I have it here. So here's the tweet. Ben says, the Biden administration is now effectively preparing to make aid to Israel contingent on unspecified changes to Israeli policy, which means that Israel can do little or nothing to appease the White House. Hamas is now in control of the Biden administration. So, I mean, there's a lot of criticisms of Biden saying Hamas is literally in control of the White House. What did you think when you saw that tweet? Because I was just like, that's kind of crazy.
Well, the funny thing about it is that there will be there certainly are a group of right wingers and a group of left wingers, and I'm sure we all see them. They're in my internet, in my Twitter comments and stuff. I don't know exactly who they represent or whether it's just people saying wild stuff online. It's mostly anonymous accounts, but there's certainly people who will say very over the top, hateful things about Jews and have a lot of conspiracies about how Jews run the government and things like that, which is precisely the type of thing that Ben Shapiro would point to and say, look at this anti-Semitism on the rise. They're saying the Jews run our government or something like that. And I don't think that's a very there's a lot of Jews disproportionately in positions of power. That's undeniably true. But I do think it's pretty sloppy and not accurate to just create this the Jews run everything type of narrative. But the idea that Hamas runs our government is like 1,000 times more ridiculous than that. You know, like that's just, you can't even point to anything like these Jew haters can point to that even indicate like Hamas is in control of the Biden administration, and therefore the policy of the Biden administration has been to support the assault on Gaza. It just makes absolutely no sense.
It reads to me almost too as like, if America wants anything out of that deal, then they're Hamas. You know, like, because I don't like Biden and I don't think he's doing a good job on almost any. I can't really think of more than 3 things that I could even compliment him on besides eating ice cream cones. He seems like he's pretty skilled at that, I guess, you know, like on camera to look cool or something with his aviators on. But when it comes to this, it's like, so you're Hamas if America wants something out of that deal. So it has to be unconditional. We have to have no say, or else the accusations of Hamas come out. You know, I believe you're Jewish. Like, how many times have you been called anti-Semitic like this week or this month?
This is too many to count. Yeah. And look, Ben Shapiro can claim that, well, his beef is that he's saying it's unspecified and therefore Israel can't, you know, figure out how to do what the Biden administration wants him to do or something. Well, we all know that's not really his complaint. His complaint is that the idea that there'd even be a chance that aid to Israel would be cut off. But I'm sorry, like, look, we're $34 trillion in debt. We're broke, and we're saddling the next generation with this burden. And for just on those grounds alone, we could say, no one gets any aid. We don't have anything to give. We're borrowing every year just to keep our own spending going. We can't borrow money and lend it to you. I just think about how ridiculous that is. Like, right. If you were broke and just racking up your credit card bills, and then someone asked you to borrow money and you were like, yeah, sure, no problem. You'd be like, that's obviously irresponsible. You're not in a position to lend money to anyone. You don't have any money. So just on that, we have a right to not. And the implication is that therefore that indicates that we are terrorists, or we are controlled by the terrorists if we were to make the decision that it's not in our interest to lend you money that's outrageous.
Yeah, the rhetoric games are interesting because what you were saying, how the response to the Tucker video, like I almost found it just as interesting as the video, seeing how all sides were reacting. And also this is annoying too, because it's like, are you this camp or this camp? It's like, I'm myself. I'm not responsible for what like both sides do. Like, I'll tell you what I think, and that's what I think. I can't handle 5 million other adults yelling at each other on Twitter. And they always try to like throw you in a camp and to say that like you're that guy because he left that comment. And it's like, dude, I went on a cruise one time. The first thing someone said to me was F you as soon as I posted. It's like, you know, if I could control not just like a random account, but you know, it's like people just say things and it's like, oh, that wasn't what I wanted to hear. It would have been like, hey, how are you doing? It was nicer. But in general, the rhetoric games of like someone like Ben Shapiro is fascinating to me because on one hand, if you listen to his show, it's clear he really likes Israel and he really supports Israel. Nothing wrong with that. And then he'll even go so far as to throw out accusations of blood libel, anti-Semitism, or Hamas on anybody that doesn't adapt almost his identical foreign policy. But then on the same time, he'll tweet out things saying that you can't say any Jewish person in America's loyalty to Israel or else that's anti-Semitic. So it's like you almost like shame people if they aren't loyal to Israel. You know, I do think that there's probably millions of Jews that aren't loyal to Israel. And I think it bothers Ben Shapiro. So it's like, it's just wild because I actually don't think that every Jewish person is loyal to Israel. In fact, I know that it's not true because anyone could see that it's not true. There's left-wing, right-wing Palestinian activists blocking subway stations. There's Ben, there's other people's opinions. There's you. But it's like both, you just get called names either way. It's like he wants them to be loyal. They're not loyal, so they're Hamas. But then if you say that there are loyalty out there, or there is loyalty out there, then that's also anti-Semitic. So it's like, I don't understand where this kind of goes, because I think over the last couple months, it's only created probably tens of millions of people that never even thought about this stuff at all. And they're pretty much just like, all right, that doesn't make sense. And, you know, I think Ben's lost a lot of favor because of it. And, you know, I don't know if he knows it or if people see that or not, because I see on Twitter, as you probably do, there's that kind of like Ben Shapiro, DeSantis Republican, and they just kind of call everything anti-Semitic all the time. And it's just like exhausting.
Yeah, no, 100%. And, you know, I was always aware of who Ben Shapiro was since he's been, you know, a public figure, because I was I got politically like radicalized during the Ron Paul presidential campaigns, and all you got to do is go put Ron Paul into a search of Ben Shapiro tweets, and you can find the vicious stuff he was saying about him back then. So I always knew who Ben Shapiro was, and
Right.
like, yeah, that's the game that he's involved in, is like viciously smearing anybody who dares to criticize Israel. And by the way, Ron Paul was never even that critical of Israel. He was really just like, we shouldn't be picking a side in this. Like, it's their business, do what they want. We should have nothing to do with this. I mean, he may have pointed out that Gaza was a concentration camp a time or two, but like, it is. So, okay. But the idea that there's something kind of ironic about the fact that it's the Zionists and the Jew haters are the only two groups of people who agree that it's all Jews. You know what I'm saying? That like that yes, Israel does represent Jews. So they both feel that if the government of Israel does something, that's proof that it's Jews. You know what I mean? Just from opposite ends. So like, if you criticize what the government of Israel does, then that's the same thing as just criticizing Jews. Or if you love what the government of Israel does, that's the same thing as loving Jews. But of course, this is just, stupid. And some of the best critics of Israel, people like Glenn Greenwald and Max Blumenthal and Finkelstein, and so many of these guys are all Jewish. And that's part of the reason, I think, why they speak out against it, because they're like, yeah, what you're doing in my name is wrong.
Right. I'll tell you my story, and like you could kind of tell me a little bit of yours. Like, Israel was not really on the map for me. Like with Ron Paul, I liked his personality, but I wasn't into politics. Like, I didn't see, and then I did see like the tweets that Ben fired off on him. It was wild. But after moving along in conservative politics, I was always just like, Trump's not as bad as people are saying, or at least like what they're criticizing him for is all the things that he's doing right, and then the things that he's doing wrong never get talked about because it's always this like fake war. And everybody kind of liked me in the Republican Party. Not everybody, but like I was invited to events, this and that. Then I realized that Trump and DeSantis passed these anti-Semitism laws. Some of them are anti-BDS laws where you can't boycott or divest. Some of them just have this list of like 10 or 11 phrases that they say that saying that people control institutions is anti-Semitic. One of them says that you can't say that any person in America that's Jewish has loyalty to Israel. One of them includes Jesus in it. And I was it had nothing to do with Israel. Like, it was a place that I wanted to visit. I'd always respected and heard great things about. Like, I know friends who've been there that are like, yo, it's one of my favorite places I've ever been. Yeah. So I had no negative feelings literally ever. And I still really don't, as far as like people. And I don't even consider myself a critic, although I'd probably be perceived that way. I'm an American citizen. I'm definitely more conservative now, but I'm also pretty libertarian on taxes and speech and, amendment stuff. And I just thought it was an infringement on the First Amendment that didn't make sense. As soon as I did that, similar to how they treated Ron Paul, every door just closed on me, and I've been called anti-Semitic since that day. And, even to this point, like I'll weigh in on war stuff when it comes up, but that's kind of my concern. Not to say I'm not concerned with innocent lives and all that. It's just like that the foreign aid, getting called Hamas and anti-Semitic all the time. And then the speech laws are wild. And I don't see a lot of the people that are calling everyone anti-Semitic all the time. I never see them talk about the speech laws, which makes you believe that, they either support them or don't think an infringement on the First Amendment is worth talking about, because it infringes on the First Amendment for their bias. People like Dave Rubin and Shapiro, who have openly, repeated some of the things done almost in a celebratory fashion.
Well, yeah, and on top of that, I mean, these are people whose claim to fame, who made millions of dollars off of like free speech,
right?
Like we turned free speech into like a right-wing trait. Well, sorry, we're the last ones who are for free speech, and we're against cancel culture, and we're against identity politics. I mean, this was like from 2017, 2018, like this was all they would talk about. And same with DeSantis, like the I'm fighting the woke, people and all of this. And then as soon as the topic of Israel comes up, they all dye their hair blue and start identifying as a they, them. Like, they all become the biggest woke people in our society, where you're just labeled a bigot for even wanting to have a conversation. You're shut down, you're canceled, you're called all types of vicious names. And yeah, it's appalling. I mean, it's appalling when the left does it, but it's even more appalling to me when these guys, who their whole claim to fame was that they're against that stuff. And look, like I'm somewhat similar to you on this, where I do think just like that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians from the very beginning has been totally inexcusable. And I find it amazing that anybody can do the mental gymnastics to look at this and try to interpret the history in a way where there's always an excuse going back. You know what I mean? Like since 1948 and even before, there's always an excuse for why the Jews had to ethnically cleanse them, why they had to occupy them, why they have to bomb them, it's ridiculous. They've been occupying and dominating Palestinians since, let's just say, for the sake to not go back to the ethnic cleansing stuff, since 1967. West Bank has been occupied since 1967. I'm sorry, that's just unacceptable. You just can't do that to any group of people and expect them to not want to resist.
Can I ask you a
violently?
Because
Sure.
I think you understand it more than me. As far as I obviously know some stuff, I'm not ignorant to the topic, but the counter narrative to that would be like, and I see a lot of people make it, and I've never heard the response, so I want to hear yours. They'll say, well, it's not a genocide, and it's not that because the number is growing. Like I hear that quite often, where it's like if it was a genocide, it would be less, but it's more. That's what.
Well, look, I'll say this, right? Like, forget the genocide argument is really revolves around what the international law definition of genocide is, which is fairly vague. And it's something like, if you with intent tried to destroy a group either fully or partially based on religion, ethnicity, nationality, or any of these characteristics. And so in the definition in international law, it's either the whole or a part of the group. And they don't exactly specify what percentage of the part it has to be. But so almost like forgetting the semantics of that, of whether you call it a genocide or not, morally, the defense, like the idea that like, well, I have the power to kill all of you and I didn't. So if I have a machine gun and nobody else is armed and I run into a room with 100 people and I murder 30 of them, and my defense is, well, I could have murdered all 100, but I only murdered 30. That's not a very good moral defense. It's like, okay, well, you should be convicted of murder on 30 counts. Like and it's not so true. Just because Israel has a much stronger government, or has a government, doesn't mean that it's exactly clear that they could just kill the 2 million people in Gaza. I mean, like, think about how much international opinion is already turned on Israel since they've been doing what they're doing. If they just slaughtered every man, woman, and child in Gaza, it would guarantee there'd be no way America could defend them anymore. There'd be no way, and it would just be too transparent. Other Arab countries would probably invade. It would, it's just like, it's not exactly the case that they just could kill everyone if they wanted to. But if you just look at what they're actually doing to Palestinians, it's been basically a never-ending atrocity since the creation of Israel.
Do you think, because I want to just hear your response, just to challenge a little bit, and not
Sure.
because I necessarily believe it, but you seem to like have a strong opinion and know a lot. A lot of people in Israel, they seem like nervous that what they're doing is going to be done to them, and in some cases has been done to them on that day, and probably in fractions across like the last 70, 80 years. But it seems like that's their mindset, is like, if we don't do this to them, they're going to do it to us, or they are doing it to us. Do you think there's any validity to the fact that people in Palestine want to wipe out Israel?
Oh yeah. I mean, look, there's certainly a lot of people in Palestine who want to, I mean, like the question becomes like, do they have any ability to do that? Look, there are certainly a lot of people in Palestine who resent that a Jewish state was ever created in what was historically Palestine. It's somewhere between 700 and 800,000 people were kicked out of what is now Israel and never allowed to return. And a lot of them cling to the idea of a right to return. And they're like, hey, you never had a right to create this state to begin with. That being said, none of them have the power to do that. Obviously, they don't even have the power to stop Israel from dominating them, let alone to start dominating Israel. And when there's been serious peace negotiations, which there have been throughout the years, That's never been what's been on the table. On the table has never been, oh, maybe Israel will cease to exist and all the Jews will go back to Europe and this is all going to be Palestine and an Arab state. It's always been 1967 borders, two-state solution, the end of the occupation, things like that. So that, that's the more real conversation.
Right. With what you're saying too, is that there's some people in Palestine that would want to do that, but they don't have the power. Do you think that leads to like Israel being nervous about that? Like, I don't ever want these people to get that power, because if they get that power, they're going to want to do this to us. Like, I'm just saying, I think that is how they're thinking, is like,
I think you're right. Hold on. I just want to find this, slavery quote. There's the Thomas Jefferson slavery quote. I'm trying to remember.
While you find it, I'll just say this too, because I wanted to get your response to those things, just to push back and kind of challenge. But I think in general, Israel, this is my view at least. I'm not Genghis Khan. I'm not a politician. I have pretty much no systemic power. Nobody listens to me, not Putin, not Zelensky. Unfortunately, no one cares about my opinion in the world. I have a podcast and I do okay for myself. But with that being said, I don't have the right to tell Israel or Palestine what to do, but people don't have to like it. And I think that's what's going on with Israel, is they can respond more aggressively than most people like. But that doesn't mean people have to like it. And in America, I find it like a crazy strategy to do a bunch of things that people don't like as a nation, and then basically try to say it's hate speech to say that it's even happening, and then police the speech on people. It's only making more people annoyed. So it's like that strategy is just kind of crazy to me, where it's
I completely agree.
And I wanted to say this real quick. There's a clip of the Shah going around of Iran from like the 1970s, where he said that he feels like there's a lot of Israeli influence in American media. And he's like, it's actually hurting Israel because it's pushing a lot of people around and almost creating more disdain that wasn't even there originally. So, I think that's a huge problem. Even with me, I've been called anti-Semitic like 100 times. And I could easily just say, yeah, Dave, you're right. I'm pushing back against what you're saying just to get like an intellectual discussion about it. And they still just rag on me constantly. And I would say it's mostly, pro-Zionist media calling me these things. So that's like, they've basically told me like, yeah, this is who you are. We're going to tell everybody this who you are for the rest of your life. For what? For liking the First Amendment? For not even believing you don't have a right to exist? I think they do have a right to exist. I don't think everyone has to like everything they're doing, especially when it's like hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money when people can't afford eggs, and then telling us that our opinion doesn't even matter. And the Constitution's basically being used as toilet paper for Trump, DeSantis, and the GOP.
Yeah. So, I completely agree. But anyway, I couldn't find the quote that I was looking for. But so to your point of like, are the Israelis worried? Like, let's even concede that like we've mistreated the Palestinians all these years, but if we stop now, they want to kill us. Like, we've gotten them so pissed off at us. And that is the thinking of a lot of Israelis. And there is, I believe it's a Thomas Jefferson quote. There's something where he was talking about slavery, and he said something like we've got the tiger by its mouth and we can neither keep him nor let him go. You know what I mean? Type of deal. And this was a major concern, by the way, of that abolitionists would get challenged with. In America, they go, well, if we free the slaves now, they're all going to try to kill us. I mean, if we free them, then they got a right to get guns and stuff like that too. And they're not going to forget that we enslaved them all of these years. And like, I can understand what that argument is. But look, if we're thinking about the slavery example, but what's the response that all of us would just have? Just, yeah, but you can't keep people as slaves. Like, I don't know. Yeah. Maybe that is a risk to some degree. And listen, if you freed them and then they attacked you, then we'd be having a different conversation. But that's not the conversation right now. The conversation right now is that you have people you're keeping as property and you can't do that. And so that's kind of my same thing with the situation in Israel. And I would just add one more thing to that like, look, it may seem impossible that like, are you telling me that there's ever a scenario you could imagine where like Israel is here with their independence and freedom in a state, and Palestine is here with their freedom and independence in a state, and they could live next to each other and not be like violent enemies? And I understand where that seems crazy right now, but I'll tell you, just late last year, I went to London, England to do some comedy shows, and then I got on a 45-minute flight over to Ireland and did comedy shows there in Ireland. And those two are right next to each other, and they're cool. And they were fighting just like that. You know what I mean? For many, many years. France and Germany are right there next to each other. You know what I mean? Like, it's actually, it's not. And a more relative example is Israel and Egypt. Israel and Egypt went to war in 48. They had another war in the 50s. They went to war in 67. They went to war in the 70s. They went to war over and over and over again. And you know what? Then they made a peace deal in the late 70s. And they've had peace ever since. Well, you can make these deals and move on. And don't tell me there's not a radical Islam problem in Egypt.
And, you know, in Japan, I think they all love America rap music and wear like Adidas sweat jackets now. You know, they love American culture. That wasn't that long ago that we fought. I guess my last question on that topic, then I want to move on to something else is, do you think, because I'm listening to everything you're saying, processing it, do you think if when Israel came to that land, if they treated Palestinians better then, that they could have lived in peace way easier? Like, do you think that them moving there and the mistreatments is leading to, like, now you're saying, like, even though Palestine doesn't have a lot of power, of course, a lot of people are pissed off and they don't want to share the land. Do you think it was always that way? Or do you think it's been like 70, 80 years of just mistreatment that has led to all the disdain?
Oh, I mean, I think there's no question. And I think that the Israelis know this. Look, the Jews lived in relative peace. There was always a small group of Jews in Palestine, always going back thousands of years, and they lived relatively in peace. I mean, they had it much better there than the Jews in Europe had it, for sure. This is part of the reason why the early Zionists wanted to go to Palestine. I mean, obviously part of it for religious reasons. They weren't religious, the early Zionists, but they thought that could inspire Jewish people to rally around their religion to go back there. But part of it was because that the Arabs had always treated the Jews reasonably well. They weren't dealing with pogroms like they were in Europe. And this is, I'm not saying that this changes as Zionists start to go settle the land and there's more and more problems. But I'll just, there's quotes up and down all day I could give you. But there's one, Moshe Dayan, who was the defense minister during the 1967 war. And there was, in 1956, there was, so this is 8 years after the creation of the state of Israel. There was a Jewish lieutenant, somebody like that, and he got killed right outside of Gaza. A few Arabs jumped him and killed him. And Moshe Dayan gave the eulogy at his funeral. And he got up there, and the first thing he said was, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is pretty much spot on. He was like, first off, let's not blame the murderers, because who are we to judge them for hating us? They hate us because they're refugees watching us build a nation and land that used to be theirs. And they're going to continue hating us. And he was a pro-Zionist. He wasn't like giving a speech saying, he was like, but let's just get real here. Okay. Like, we all know why they hate us. And there's Ehud Barak said that if he was a young Arab, he would join a terrorist organization too. This was the prime minister of Israel. They know this stuff. It's just, look, this isn't even like I'm like a libertarian dove. I don't, you know what I mean? Like I'm anti almost every war. I mean, I believe in self-defense, and I believe like a war like the American Revolution, I think, is justified. You're being invaded by an army and you fight them out of your country. But these guys aren't. Look, General McChrystal certainly isn't a libertarian dove, right? He was the guy who was in charge of the war in Afghanistan before it was given to Petraeus. And he's the one who came up with insurgent math, right? And the whole thing was, he goes, what's 10 minus 2? And everyone goes 8. And he goes, wrong, 20. 10 minus 2 is 20 when you're doing insurgent math, because you kill 2 people. But guess what? Those 2 people have brothers, they got fathers, they got friends, and all of those people now join the insurgency. And for all the guys who went over and fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, they all know this. You get given a list. Here are the targets. You start taking people off the target. They go, here's your updated list. And it's 3 times as long as the last one was. There's no question that this type of oppression breeds hatred. It's the nature of humanity.
Yeah. On that note, you know, I'll say something that I see on Twitter is like a lot of people are complaining about anti-Semitism on Twitter and saying like it's rising, it's growing. And like, you know, Elon kind of opened the floodgates, let people back on. And a lot of the comment sections are filled with criticism of Israel and just Jewish people in general. Yep. And to me, I saw this all coming because in 2019, just watching how Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro treated, you know, just in some cases, really basic criticism of what they were doing. and trying to sweep it all under the rug and basically label everyone as anti-Semitic. I was like, they're kicking a lot of people out of the conservative movement who had questions then about homosexuality, about the speech laws. And were they edgy questions? Absolutely. But it didn't look like Charlie really had any interest in answering it. It's like, it was real gatekeeper. Like, I'm going to do this. I'm what's conservative. And you guys basically go screw themselves. So a lot of people did go, not literally screw themselves, but it's like, they went somewhere else. And now there's BitChute, Rumble, Twitter. There's a lot of places people can seek information. And the Charlie Kirk, Ben Shapiro vibes are losing. And then in response, I think the people's gut response is just to say there's so much hate rising, there's so much anti-Semitism rising. But Candace touched on it with Rabbi Barclay, where it's like, first of all, what's your definition of anti-Semitism? Because that's important for that word. And he took it back 2,000 years to basically times of Jesus, which made me think about what you were saying, even with the Muslims and Arabs. Like, I understand the complex history of Judaism and just Jews in general as a race, but it's like, it does seem that, there's a lot of pain there when it comes to Europeans and Christians because of how history went. So like I didn't know that, but he took anti-Semitism back to the times of Christ. And it's like, okay, so then that's your definition, but what's the definition being passed by the State Department, Trump, DeSantis, and all that? Because it's a way different definition. And that definition, technically, then I guess you're right. Everything is anti-Semitic because, like, Ted Cruz passes it, but then he gets called anti-Semitic because he said Bloomberg owned media. I'm guessing he was referring to a media company. I don't think Bloomberg runs the whole media, but like, he got called anti-Semitic. Trump said Israel used to run Congress. He got called anti-Semitic. And then people in the Trump camp go, well, Trump's not anti-Semitic. Of course not. He's pro-Israel. He does a lot of stuff for that nation, but he did pass that into law. So I would say, the lack of self-awareness and self-accountability is leading to the rise in anti-Semitism, because just they've defined it so broadly that everything technically will, like, yeah, I guess Tucker is anti-Semitic. I guess, saying that Israel did something not by mistake is anti-Semitic by the definition they're passing. So it's like, how could it not rise when you've expanded the definition, passed it through law, and like 95% of conversations on X now would technically fall under that category.
Right. So, okay. So a couple thoughts on that. Number one, that Rabbi Barclay guy he called me a self-hating Jew in that podcast, which I did find pretty amusing.
Oh, I missed that part. I got to chop that up.
Yeah. Candace brought me up at one point because she was like, oh, I had a guy, Dave Smith, he's Jewish, and he was on, and he was criticizing Israel. And he's like, yeah, there's, well, a self-hating Jew, blah, or whatever. But there is this thing you run into a lot. And I think for people like us, it's something we got to kind of work to make sure we understand, that there are sometimes you run up against someone who's playing a different game than you're playing. And we're kind of playing this game where we're trying to tell the truth as we see it. We're trying to kind of seek more information. We're trying to have interesting conversations. If you have a debate with someone or a conversation, you're going to be trying to like see what points they're making and then see if your counters are strong. And there's other people who are just being totally disingenuous. Like, they're not playing that game. And that's the type of person that Rabbi Barclay is. He's playing a tennis match. Like, you might be thinking you're having a real conversation, but his thing is just like, hey, can I get you moving over here and get the ball over there so that I win this point against you? He said at one point to Candace in there, where I don't know if you remember this part, but he goes, well, Jews will decide what anti-Semitism is. And that's in the same way that it's not for me to say what racism is. That's for black people to decide. It's not for me to say what misogyny is. That's for women to decide. And basically all he's doing is trying to set up this thing where you can't tell me my definition of anti-Semitism is wrong because you're not Jewish and I am. And then, of course, when Candace brings up that I'm Jewish, he goes, oh, that's a self-hating Jew. See, like, now all of a sudden what Jewish people say doesn't matter. But just think about how ridiculous that is. The idea that no, only a person from that group gets to decide if you're hating that group. So in other words, if I were to walk up to a black person and say, hey, good morning, great weather we've been having lately, and he goes, that's racist, I'd have to go, well, you're right. I mean, you get to decide. You get to decide what's racist. I'm not black, so I can't say, you're right, that was very racist. No, I think I could reasonably go, no, that wasn't racist. I was just saying it's been really warm the last few days, Now, the other thing that I'll say, in terms of, like, let's say we were using a sane definition of anti-Semitism, like hatred of Jewish people or something like that. And you look, is it on the rise? I think I see more of it on social media than I used to. So I don't know if you know exactly how to measure it, but I would say this is the way I look at it, which is, I could understand where people would look at it a different way, but I kind of look at it like this. Let's just say you lived in a neighborhood and a bunch of black people started coming into your neighborhood and beating people up. There's just waves of black crime coming into your neighborhood where black people are just like assaulting people. Do you think the level of racism is going to go up or down or stay the same? My guess is it's probably going to go up. There's probably going to be more people who are pissed off at black people. Now, that's not necessarily right, because it's not fair to blame black people who weren't involved. Like if there's just some black dude down the block who didn't assault anyone, and like he's like, dude, I just fucking go to work every day and like come home. I don't know. I didn't do that. It's not right for you to blame him for that. But at the same time, I wouldn't sit there, especially as a black person, if you were in that situation and you just went, this rise in racism is horrible. It's like, you also might want to mention, like, hey, black people, stop beating people up in this neighborhood. You know what I'm saying? And so my attitude is like, yeah, I don't want to see a rise in people who hate Jews. I'm Jewish. Obviously, that's not in my interest. I don't want to see that. But my first response isn't to go, hey, what you guys are saying is anti-Semitic and you're a bunch of Jew haters. My first response is going like, hey, guys, could we not do the thing that is clearly driving more anti-Semitism? You can't just be slaughtering a group of people and then say anybody who has a problem with that is a horrible person and we're going to try to ruin your life for questioning these government policies, which is, by the way, what all of these people do. I mean, from AIPAC to all of these neocon commentators, they will literally try to ruin your life for the crime of suggesting America shouldn't be supporting Israel. And so, yeah, I think that's creating a lot more hatred of Jews.
Well, I think what you're talking about is self-accountability and self-awareness. And I've been saying, I think that's like a huge piece of the puzzle that people like Ben Shapiro and others are missing, that it's just like, you got to think about these things, because if you say you can't have a definition, you can't define what it is, like you were talking about, but then also it's being passed into legislation against the First Amendment. Well, I actually can, because it's infringing on the First Amendment in a way that's lopsided and only for one group. I wanted to ask you this, because, the accusations of being like a self-hating Jew, I think to some, not everyone, and this is, I think, the huge, weird rhetoric bubble that they've trapped themselves in, because they'll say you can't say that you can't say that a Jew in America is loyal to Israel. Like, that's anti-Semitism to suggest loyalty. But then they look at you, and I think why they think you're self-hating is because you're not loyal. And I think you're pretty loyal to America, and I think that's what kind of bothers a lot of people. So it's like they say you can't say that, but then when someone comes along that's clearly not that, and there's a lot of people like that, they hate it. So it's like, do you, because I think especially the Jewish ethnic group, it's a very tight-knit group. There's a lot of organizations. It's very historic and ancient, and I think they feel betrayed by you not caring about it as much as they do, like not care. I think that's kind of the problem, is like Dave's out here not really caring about us in Israel more than he cares about America.
Right.
Like it
right.
seems
Well,
like that's the point of contention. Yeah.
Well, if there's a few things on that, like, I mean, look, number one, I have two little kids and they're not Israelis. They're Americans. They're growing up here. I have no plans to leave. And that is it's not like I care about that more. It's like that's all I care about. That is the priority above any other priority that I've ever had in my life, is like what country they're going to grow up in. So my first loyalty in the world is to my children, and they're Americans growing up here. So my number one concern is always what kind of country they're going to grow up in. And I think that all of the terror wars over the last 20 plus years have, in a profound way, wrecked this country. I think so much of what we're living in right now and the political chaos that we're living under is due to the fact that we fought these decades-long catastrophe wars in the Middle East. And that's look, you can go read. I highly recommend everyone does. It's a short read. It's called A Clean Break. A Strategy for Securing the Realm. And it was written by Richard Pearl, who became one of the most influential neocons in the George W. Bush administration. And David Wormser, I think, was the other guy who wrote it. And this was a letter in 1996. And it was all about the strategy for why we need regime change in Iraq. And this was not written to Bill Clinton, who was the president at the time, and it wasn't written to Bob Dole, who was the Republican nominee for the president that year. It was written to Benjamin Netanyahu, who was the brand new prime minister in Iraq. And the whole strategy was, look, this is the way that you can get out of the peace process with the Palestinians. Yitzhak Rabin had started this peace process in the early 90s. It's 1996 now. And they go, well, look, here's what you can do. If you engage with the broader Arab world and transform that the way you want to, you won't have to deal with the Palestinians. So in other words, you won't have to give them their own state if we can go topple Iraq, right? So I'm not saying this is the only reason why we ended up fighting the war in Iraq, but I've read Richard Pearl's own writing on this, and it was a big part of the reason why he supported it. And so a lot of these wars have been because that the neoconservatives in America are very concerned with what they think is best for Israel. And so I'm sorry, I'm not going to not mention that there's a group of very powerful people who are at least also thinking about what's best for Israel here. And those policies, when enacted, are destroying the country that I live in.
Right. I think a lot of people, most people, I would think, would listen to what you said and say, wow, that's a really honest father. You know, that's a really honest man. Other people would look at that and say, he just committed multiple offenses of anti-Semitism and blood libel. You know, and it's like, you know, I know you know this, but it's like the calling it that, you know, I saw like the accusations of that, it only makes more people not agree with you. And it's actually bad for America, and in my opinion, bad for Israel, and bad for Jewish people of all types, because responding to like and I'm not saying they're saying that now, but you know, I've been just watching Twitter and people calling people names, and it's like, how do they not see that that's just making people support it less? You know, and your opinion is making people like support it more and be like, wow, that's real, that's honest. You know, it's you're helping way more, and a lot of people hate you for it.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. And I also think that people get, particularly when the issue of war comes up, people get very tribal and very stupid. This happens in every war. Like where you just, it's always got to be like, you know, Ukraine has to be a beacon of democracy. Like look, I'm not for the American policies that provoked this conflict in Ukraine, and I'm not for the policy of bankrolling the war, which has only drawn it out and gotten more Ukrainians killed. But like, I could understand if you were like, hey, Russia invaded Ukraine and this is not okay. You know, this is like bad that they did this. But you don't have to pretend Ukraine is a beacon of democracy. You know what I mean? Like, this is ridiculous.
Right.
Their government, they had a coup in 2014, and they've suspended elections right now while the state has like shut down opposing media and political parties. Like, what are you talking about? This is just, it's just ridiculous. And likewise, though, there can also be, like, on all sides, people do this. So I'm not like a rabidly anti-Israel person. I recognize Israel for what it is. And it's objectively, it's amazing what the Zionists pulled off. Just take morality out of it for a second. There was a group, like a ragtag group of young Jews in Eastern Europe decided we want to turn Palestine into a Jewish state, and they pulled it off. It's like, it's really incredible. Like and I mean, they got, you know, powerful international financing behind them. There was a lot of steps that came to do that, but in this state that they created a cool country, and they created a good place for their citizens to live, better for the Jewish citizens than the Arab citizens. But for the Arab citizens of Israel, quite, at least debatably, the best place in the Middle East for them to live. I think you'd rather live as the average Arab citizen in Israel than the average Arab citizen in Egypt or Saudi Arabia or something like that. And so, okay, you get credit for that. Look, like, America was absolutely wrong to fight the war in Iraq. They were wrong to do that. Our government lied us into an aggressive war, and 1 million people are dead because they lied us into that war. That doesn't mean I'm saying Saddam Hussein's Iraq is a better country than America. There's lots of great things about America. You know, it's just wrong what we did to Iraq. And that's kind of how I feel about Israel too. I think there's a lot of cool things about the country. It's just wrong what they do to the Palestinians. And I don't think that, you know, it's like, just because you say that doesn't mean, like, just because I say George W. Bush's war in Iraq was wrong doesn't mean I hate America. Certainly doesn't mean I hate Americans, like that I hate all of the people or anything like that. But I also, on top of that, also recognize that the war in Iraq made America less secure, not more. There was no terrorism in Iraq before the war, and then it was a hotbed for Al-Qaeda and ISIS afterward. And in the same way, I actually think what Israel's doing right now to Gaza is putting themselves in more jeopardy than they've ever been in my lifetime.
Right. And I think it's also wrong for the press in America and certain politicians to just constantly slander American citizens who are concerned about America in the same way that other people are concerned about their countries. I've never criticized Israeli citizens for wanting to protect themselves, but at the same time, I get slandered constantly for, believing in the First Amendment and not some speech law that says that Ben Shapiro can tell me that I'm committing some sort of libel.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, I want to play one of the most iconic clips of the last few months. And I don't remember if it was longer than that, but this is just a quick clip of you with RFK, asking about lobbying and politics, and one of the longest pauses I've ever seen him take. And I just want to get your immediate reaction to this and show my audience who's never seen it.
Do you have concerns about the level of Israeli influence in our politics here in the United States of America?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a politician in political office, so I don't see my.
So he's got an articulate opinion about everything. RFK is one of the most honest people I've ever seen in American politics. Yet with that long pause, and now all of a sudden he's not a politician.
Yeah, no, he has no idea.
Excuse me, sorry.
You got no problem talking about and the funny thing is, he went on. It was like a week after that where there was a bill that had the funding for Ukraine and the funding for Israel in it. And he came out with a long thing where he said, we're $30+ trillion in debt, and this funding is just a payoff for the military industrial complex. No more funding the war in Ukraine. And you're like,
right.
But what? Why won't you say that about the other ones? The exact same situation. He'll certainly talk about the influence of big pharma or anything like that. Look, I think I should have followed up after he said, I don't know. And I should have been like, yeah, but what about all that stuff you were thinking about for 7 seconds before you answered me? Remember? Remember all those thoughts going through your head about how you're not allowed to answer this question, honestly?
You wish he had a thought bubble there, right? He was really thinking into that pause. His face, he looked so nah, I'm not.
Look, very quick story of somewhat recent American history, okay? After 9/11, it was Colin Powell who went to George W. Bush. Colin Powell, of course, being the wisest member of the George W. Bush administration. He didn't want to fight the war in Iraq and knew those were all. Now, he still sold it. He still went to the UN and sold it. And he better, he had to meet his maker and explain that to him. So Colin Powell's got his own problems where he's at. But he was the wisest member of the George W. Bush administration. And right after 9/11, he went to George W. Bush and he said, you have to do a 2-state solution, and you have to do it now. You have to make Israel give the Palestinians a state. This is it's the centerpiece of why we have to deal with this terrorism problem, is that we're propping up Israel and they're holding down the Palestinians. And this is, of course, in Osama bin Laden's declaration of war and in his letter to America. This is all over the terrorist propaganda. It's the biggest recruiting tool that they have. And Colin Powell was like, look, post 9/11, George W. Bush has record high approval ratings. He's like, now's the time. You got to do it now. And George W. Bush was like, okay, Colin Powell tells me to do it, then that's what we got to do. And it was Tom DeLay in the House of Representatives who told George W. Bush that if you even try, I can guarantee you'll be a one-term president, because I will turn 60 million evangelical Christians against you, and I got the Israel lobby that'll make sure I do it too. That'll make sure this happens. So just knowing this story, how are you going to tell me they don't have too much influence in American politics? I mean, come on. There's a gigantic lobby called AIPAC that their job is to ruin your life if you criticize this country. If this was any other country, like if it was any other nation, you'd be like, that's insane. That's just insane. That's an insane way to operate politically. And I'm sorry, but like, I just look, like same thing with you here, dude. Like, if we're gonna do this, if we do whatever this weird thing that we do is, what's the point of us if we don't just tell the truth? Like, what's the point? Then what the hell we're no better than CNN. Then we're no better than anyone. You know what I mean? So right. I'm sorry. No, RFK, you know this. You know this is true. So, okay, you're playing a different game than I'm playing. Like, you're playing politics, you're running for president. All right, I'm playing the I tell the truth game. Right. But that's the game I'm playing. I tell the truth. And the truth is that, yes, Israel has a tremendous amount of influence on our domestic politics. And the truth is that RFK knows that, and he won't tell you.
And there's a risk in everything in this world, but I think like constantly lying or playing that game, it's a fleeting game. It's like an energy drink, you know, it doesn't last forever. Yeah. On that note, you know, Matt Walsh, I found just through Twitter, that the platform, you know, that he wrote an article in the 2010s about the, you know, the Israeli lobby and how they were calling everybody anti-Semitic who talked about it. And since then, he like rarely talks about that. And once Candace got fired, you know, a lot of people were kind of pushing back a little bit on Michael Knowles and Clavin and whatever it was, Matt Walsh, just like, how come you won't say this and that? And Matt did make a video on the anti-Semitism speech law that Abbott passed, but
I saw that.
Right. But I truly believe it was because he got ratioed on Twitter and just kind of looked like a fool and a coward. So he did it kind of out of self-preservation 5 years after they've been passing these laws. He's never mentioned it once. You know, I know my answer, but I'll just ask you, do you think that, and I know Ben Shapiro doesn't like questions. I'm just asking questions. You know, he has got a big vendetta against questions. But, you know, do you think that people at these organizations, Prager, Daily Wire, TPUSA, they're so afraid to touch this topic because they know if you even get within 15 feet of it, you'll be called anti-Semitic and, you know, your career gets a lot harder? I obviously do think that that's happening everywhere. I know it's happening. And, you know, it's like, it's an interesting phenomenon once the Candace thing happened, because that's why everyone's talking about it. It's not just because it's about her and Ben. It's this thing that's been swept under the rug for 5 years. And people like Matt Walsh wrote articles heavily talking about it 10 years ago. And seems like he's wildly uninterested in revisiting that. And it's still happening.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I'm speculating if I talk about what's going on in the minds of people at these organizations. I'll say that there's no question that you're right, that is what happens. Like, this is what happens. It is a little bit different than it's ever been before, because of course there are, which I think is one of the most positive developments in the last few years, is that there are some people who seem to be uncancelable. And the first example that really was interesting was of course Joe Rogan, when he had like the biggest cancel attempt ever put on his head, and it totally failed. And he's still as big as ever. And of course, there's Tucker Carlson, who got fired from Fox News, is now bigger than ever on X. And I think Candace is in that category. I mean, she's got like 5 million followers on Twitter. She's not going anywhere. She's going to be in the conversation. But for many years, they were able to just remove you from the conversation. You know, like people who got fired, people who got canceled were just gone. They were out of the national conversation. And so I think they're still holding on to those tactics. But I think that the people at the top of Daily Wire, at the top of Prager University and things like that, I think they are ideologically committed Zionists. And they look, particularly for people like Ben Shapiro, I do believe that it's a religious belief that he has. Like, he believes that God promised his people this land, and therefore that's their land. And if that's what you're starting from, then yeah, What are you concerned about the freedom of speech for people to have a right to criticize what God promised your people? That's not that important, really, in the grand scheme of things. And so you are like, these people are committed ideologically to this Zionist belief. And yeah, I think they're quite happy to control the conversation and steer it away from anything critical of that.
Yeah, and it's an interesting phenomenon because I think everything in this world comes at a cost. Like everybody makes mistakes, everybody chooses a path, but I'm trying to be honest, I'm trying to do good work, I'm trying to be thoughtful. You said you're committed to the truth. People like Ben, and I know some of my audience might not like this because even though he is being heavily criticized in many ways now, he's still very popular among certain groups. I think he's lying about so much that it must be exhausting. Like I don't envy that, or I'm not jealous of that at all, because I can't imagine what it's like to basically make an entire career off of saying free speech, no safe spaces on college campus, but actually supporting it. Like Governor Abbott's law and tweet and little declaration he made literally said we need to create a safe space on college campus to police speech and rhetoric, and that we should revisit our free speech policies. Like he's not just talking about violence or protests gone too far. Those are already illegal. Like, and even calls to violence are already illegal and at least like investigating, like, but that's not what he's talking about. That's all already on the books as it is. He's talking about making safe spaces the same way LGBT left-wingers do. So it's like Ben and Dave Rubin, people like that, they have told a lot of truth, but overall, it seems like their ideology is more important than the truth. So they get caught in these weird, constant accusations and lies, like blood libel, this, that, like anti-Semitism, and I do think that it's got to be like a tough way to live. Like I almost kind of feel bad because it's how hard is that to? I don't have to think that much. I have nothing written here. I'm just saying what I really think, and I really believe what I'm saying, or else I wouldn't say it. With them, it feels like you're saying, this whole different game they're playing, and I can't imagine doing that.
Yeah, no, look, I agree. It's not something that I would want. And there's lots of different ways that you can make your life hell. And I can't imagine one much worse than that, than like constantly lying and having to keep up this lie. I think that there's just something about the moment that we live in right now, and I think this is to some degree true with like the P. Diddy stuff. It's true, like we just live in this time where it's much harder to lie, it's much harder to keep this stuff going, and people just begin to see through this, and there's something beautiful about that. But it would also be like a real scary time to have everything you've built be based on lies, when you can kind of feel that the truth is coming out. And I think we're seeing a lot of the reaction to that. One more thought just on the stuff of guys like Ben Shapiro. I mean, one of the things that I really resent about their whole thing is that Ben Shapiro's always been the guy who, like, hey, look, if we're like, one of the viral clips that he first blew up on, which I'm sure you've seen because it was so viral, was the thing where he's on stage with like a few other like college professor types, and he's talking about like racism. And he's like, well, let me explain, in his Ben Shapiro fast talking way. He's like, well, why is it that black people make up 13% of the population, but they make up 56% of the violent criminals? Why is it that 70% of black families don't have a father in the family? Why is it that? And you explain to me how it's white people's fault, that blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, look, I'm not saying there's not more to the conversation, but that's an important conversation to have. And he makes some fair points. And it's like, hey, when it comes to black people, he will take off the gloves and like really go at you. This is what you guys got to get right. When it comes to Muslims, he'll take off the gloves and really go at you about this is what you got to get right. But as soon as it comes to the Jews, oh, no, we can't say nothing. We can't say anything about how, okay, your guys' whole thing here was that you were going to create a state in the middle of the Arab world. And we're now, 70 years later, and you still can't get along with your neighbors, and you still haven't given them their freedom, and you're still relying on America's funding for this whole operation to work. Like, hey, there's nothing there to take the gloves off and like actually be critical about. No. We can only do that with every single other group except mine.
Right.
Like, that's bullshit.
And to go even further, I've seen him tweet out some of the anti-Semitism speech laws that are being passed, like word for word. Well, like the one he's tweeted that you can't accuse any Jewish person in America of being loyal to Israel. which is just wild because it's like he gets mad when Jewish people aren't loyal to Israel. Like,
Yeah,
he's like the
it's
attack
insane.
dog of that, where it's like, I don't believe that. I don't believe everyone is, but there's definitely some, obviously,
Yes.
Ben being one of them.
Clearly.
Like his whole image is like, it's not even a diss. It's like a comp, like he
Yeah,
loves
well,
that
look,
country. That's fine.
And look, like we interned Japanese Americans, which obviously, you know, we shouldn't have done, but we interned Japanese Americans during World War II because we were very concerned they might be loyal to Japan. And the only reason we didn't intern Italian Americans is because there were just too damn many of them in the country already, and it just wasn't feasible to do. But look, JFK, who was the first Catholic president, he had to make a big speech about how his loyalty was to America and not to the Vatican. And that if ever those two were in conflict, he is on Team America. And so, look, I don't think we should have interned anybody or anything like that, but it is a reasonable question to ask. And it's a reasonable thing to say, like, hey, look, if you're talking about this as an American political commentator, someone like Ben Shapiro, obviously you have deep feelings for Israel. Come on, you're an Orthodox Jew who talks all the time about how much you love Israel. In fact, he's said before that his favorite thing about America is that America protects Israel. He said that he's on tape saying that, you know?
I think he said my loyalty to America is a guarantor or something because of like,
something
you
like
know,
right.
I'm loyal to America because it makes me more loyal. I forget the exact wording.
But it was something like that he's the thing that gives his loyalty to America is its loyalty to Israel or something like that. But I'm just saying, okay, fine. Okay. You're allowed to feel that way. But if you do feel that way, it's also reasonable then if you're an American political commentator to go like, okay, but you gotta make a judgment call just on what's best for America here, not on what's best for this other country you love, because you don't have a right to demand that everybody else feel the way you feel, you know? And like, right. I Jews are 2% of the population here. We can't just say like, oh, because we care about Israel, therefore we demand everybody else also does, without ever explaining why they're supposed to.
Yeah, like you're saying, I didn't know that about JFK, that he had to say he wasn't loyal to the Vatican. That's interesting.
I gave a whole speech on it. Yeah.
Understandable though. You know, I say this, like I make a hypothetical because a lot of conservative commentators, like they won't touch this stuff for whatever reason, maybe ideologically, religiously, they're afraid of being blacklisted. Who knows? All the possibilities. But if I said a governor from America, right, that actually is a Catholic, he's not even Jewish, he's Catholic, flew to China to pass Chinese speech laws that say that you can't criticize China as a nation or certain Chinese people, and it gives you this list of laws that includes even a biblical reference to Jesus, they would be like, oh my gosh, that's like Chinese, oh my gosh. But it's like, that's what Ron DeSantis did in Florida. He flew to Israel and he passed the first ever Florida bill in that country, limiting the criticism of that country and conflating what I would, because I'm not even, I'm not like criticizing, I'm just speaking, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not like a big critic telling countries what to do. I'm just concerned with the First Amendment and I have a perspective. So it's like, that's what they're doing and nobody cares in the Republican Party. It's starting to change, obviously, due to social media, but it's been like a concerted effort to not talk about this stuff. I'm sure, I guess you as somebody who seems like you liked Ron Paul back in the day, this probably isn't that new to you because they pretty much did that to Ron Paul, you know, like just blackouted him and acted like he didn't exist because he was definitely like the most awesome candidate. So you must be used to it now. It's been like, you know, decades.
Yeah.
Of it.
Yeah, well, no, and look, they've been doing it to people long before Ron Paul, and they're just the truth is that cancel culture isn't a new thing. It just used to be so effective that people didn't even know it was a thing because people would just be completely removed from just scrubbed out. And this was the entire history of the conservatism Inc. rise in the 20th century. It was just all of the people who were outside of the acceptable opinion getting scrubbed out. All the John Birch Society and the Mises Institute and all the guys like that used to be in the conservative movement, and then Bill Buckley got rid of all of them. And yeah, they certainly blacked out Ron Paul back then. But I do think that you're right in like the spirit of what you're saying is that, look, whatever's going on in the world, like, I'm sorry, I'm an American. I have a right, a God-given right to have whatever opinion I want to have about any country around the world and to express that. And like, if you are an American politician with political power who's trying to crack down on Americans' rights to say what they want to say, and you're doing this in cahoots with a foreign government, then just by definition, you're my enemy. You're the enemy of freedom. It doesn't even matter. Even if you were on the right side of the issue, it wouldn't matter. You'd still be an enemy of free men.
You know, I'm compassionate about how Israelis feel and how Palestinians feel, but it's upsetting when people don't realize that I'm upset that the First Amendment's being infringed on. Just like Palestinians are afraid of bombs and Israelis are afraid of attacks and, you know, them rebelling. It's like Americans are afraid of being turned into Canada and Europe or places that have no free speech. And there's, you know, many countries in this world where you don't have what they like to call a democracy and they love to talk about so much, even though it's not really in a lot of the countries that they say it is. But here, I wouldn't call it necessarily a democracy, but let's just get on this foundation where you have religious freedom, you have the freedom of speech to talk about ethnic groups in edgy ways if you deem it, you know, beneficial to the conversation or really for whatever reason. And the thought behind that is what I still believe to this day is that when you allow certain groups to censor others or certain politicians, they don't censor properly. And I mean, we could just see it like during the COVID pandemic, it had nothing to do with ethnicity. It had everything to do with pharmaceutical criticism of lockdowns. Didn't matter if you were Jewish, Christian, white, black, Asian. Like if you did that, you got censored. Now we're seeing all this other lopsided censorship, but it's so clearly abused. And even like you were saying, when some people define certain words as the hatred of this or the hatred of that, I get that, but what do you mean by hate? Because like there's people who hate ice cream cones. There's people who think that the truth is hate. Like someone will listen to you and be like, wow, that's patriotic and that guy's the real deal. And others will say you're being hateful. Who gets to decide? And if they're lying, why did they get to pass legislation that says that everything's so hateful? Because some people literally hate the truth, even if you're calm and like have good intentions. You know, just like I'm thoughtful about other countries and how they feel. Why does it seem like no one's ever thoughtful about American citizens and certain groups here? It's almost like, you know, we're just like a cash cow where, you know, now it's all kind of boiling over and everybody's having these conversations because prices are high. We're sending hundreds of billions of dollars to multiple countries. And this country isn't as good as it was in the 2000s. I'm not saying everything's worse, but I think a lot of the reason the neocon like George Bush thing worked is because everybody liked America and felt like the economy was good. The country's great. We have freedom. Now that everyone realizes that we don't have any of those things, they don't believe it anymore. Like that script isn't working for that reason. Make America better, and then people will be more likely to buy that stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and I think you're exactly right to use COVID as the example. I mean, God, who hasn't learned the lesson after COVID that you just can't give the government this type of power? I mean, you can't give them the power to censor. You can't give them the power to like take people's freedoms away. Look what they'll do with it. And then likewise, I would hope for everybody, I imagine everybody who's listening to this show is like awake to some degree about what's going on. And also, I just think that people should really look at the track record that people had during COVID. And like, if you were calling people dopes for not taking the vaccine, you shouldn't trust that person ever again. Like, don't trust that person on the next issue. If you were one of these people who was quite happy to like advocate for people who refused a pharmaceutical product to become second-class citizens, which is genuinely what so much of the political class was not only advocating for, but actually implementing, again, like, then you're an enemy of freedom. And like, if we want to be free men, we got to recognize who the enemies of freedom are and at least not support them.
And this is a problem with giving people the power to say that they're so hateful. There's a compilation that's, I wouldn't say hilarious, but interesting. It's Louis Farrakhan and Ben Shapiro talking about the vaccine. And it's really like a mind F for a lot of conservatives, because a lot of conservatives don't like Farrakhan. Some do, but most have a very negative view of him. A lot of conservatives like Ben Shapiro, but it's Ben Shapiro telling black people to get the vaccine and complaining about how Louis Farrakhan is criticizing the vaccine. And then I have clips of Louis Farrakhan speaking, like saying like not to get it, not to trust Bill Gates. And, you know, it went viral, and I had so many people calling me like a Farrakhanite, and they're like, oh, Anomaly's a Farrakhanite. And that just shows how ridiculous people are, because it's like, listen, I'm not part of the Nation of Islam. I'm not a Farrakhanite. I've listened to speeches of everybody. I've heard Ben and Farrakhan talk, just like I listen to a lot of things because I talk about it. But it's like, I'm not a worshiper. And they're like, did you hear what he said about white people? Yeah, absolutely, I have. And it's like, I don't agree with everything he says, obviously. Like, it's just, that should be obvious. But it's so funny. That's why I presented that stuff. It's because, just because Ben's right on some things and Lewis is wrong on some things, or however you perceive it, it doesn't mean that they have this immunity that you have to trust them for every single thing. And you shouldn't give someone like Ben Shapiro the power to blacklist other people like that, because at crunch time for humanity, I gravitated more towards what Lewis was saying. And it's like, so if you blacklist him and badmouth him, but then you're wrong about the most important time in modern history, like wildly wrong in so many different ways. To me, I don't think I'm a dumb person. I definitely, I like myself, hopefully not too much, but in general, like, I don't think I'm dumb. But also, I'm not a math genius. Like, I'm definitely not somebody that can do like high level geometry and like, but this is like a third grade math equation. I figured out the COVID testing scheme in March and April because I have a calculator in third grade math. Like, I'm not talking myself up. I'm just saying, I don't believe that these people are so intelligent and just made a mistake, because it's like, how many tests were there? This is the first thing I told my audience in March. I can't tell you how bad this thing is. I don't know. But here's what I'll say. If they're only testing Rudy Gobert and sports players, and they're saying that the death rate is so high, no one can get a test, only athletes and people in the hospital. So the death rate's going to seem high. I said, as soon as they give mass testing to everybody, the death rate's going to go down. And it did do that. But I'm getting censored by the World Health Organization and YouTube for saying it. Ben Shapiro's 2 years late on some of these topics. Like, I don't think he's a super genius. I think he's either fake or stupid or combo.
Right. Or at least just isn't, either way is not reliable to get things right. And no, and you're absolutely right that it's one of the most infuriating things when you hear the people who are so bad on COVID, and they'll kind of now go, well, we were doing the best we could with the information we had. And you're like, dude, this was by April of 2020. It was obvious. And
Right.
You're talking about what you were advocating in the summer of 2021. This
Right.
is like a year and a half later, a year and a half full of all of the lies, so much more than enough information to blow all of this out of the water. Dude, there's this great book that Tom Woods just put out called Diary of a Psychosis, and he kind of goes through it chronologically. It's so good. It's like, you would really love it. But it's just like, yeah, dude, it's insane. Like, they were projecting that because Sweden didn't do lockdowns, that they would have 100,000 COVID deaths by summer of 2021. And when it came to summer, they had 6,000 COVID deaths. Like, they were off by so much. And then they just kept making more projections. They just kept doing it over and over and over. So in the face of all of that, then when they rolled out this vaccine, and you could just look at the thing and see, they hadn't even tested for transmittability in the Pfizer trials. And then they were claiming you can't get it, you can't transmit it, with no justification. And then you're out there going, yeah, get the vaccine, you dope. It's like, no, dude, you're either a liar or you fell for the biggest, most obvious propaganda campaign in human history.
I think April is a good time. Like, March, debatable. Like, if you
give you a
thought
couple
that is
weeks.
good, yeah, April, dude. If you still didn't get it by that, I remember this guy Nuance, bro. He wanted to debate me in May, and he still defends himself, which is fine. It's a funny little debate. But I said, mask mandate should be completely gone, 100%, and he said, I think 50%. And he still claims that he was right. But it's like, I mean, no, dude, because it's a slippery slope where it's like, you do 50%. Now what? Why 50%? How is that going to stop the transfer? Like, it's all super ridiculous on that front. And I wanted to say on the COVID stuff, something that was wild to me, and this, I'm glad, like, now I'm more patient and wise, and I don't let things bother me because people wake up when they want to. But it was freaking me out because during COVID, first you had millions of Q people who said they were waiting for martial law. So they're celebrating the lockdowns. They thought it was like the big moment Trump was going to arrest Chrissy Teigen and the pedophiles or whatever. So they're like, yeah. And I'm like, wait, they tricked you to like martial law and lockdowns. That's insane. These people were actually bothering me more than the mainstream media. Like, they were attacking me, calling me a shill because I was against lockdowns. And they said, shut up. Trust the plan. Trump's right. And that, he's got a secret plan for the Vatican. I was like, I don't think so. And then fast forward, like, a lot of Trump supporters, like, I remember Jack Posobiec and James Woods, they were tweeting out when Trump said Sweden should shut down. They were like, yeah, that's awesome. I remember those two specifically. God bless them. But I was like, I disagree. Like, I think Trump is turning into a communist salesman, essentially, for saying that you should be shut down like America. And this was like 2 months after the lockdown. And then fast forward 2 years, I'm not going to say I'm the only one, because there definitely were people. Even Elon Musk was very good during that time. Like, he had a lot of great intel on Joe Rogan. That podcast aged extraordinarily well, the 2021. But it's like I felt very outnumbered. And then all of a sudden, all these DeSantis supporters pretended to care about 2020 and 2022 when it was Trump versus DeSantis. And people like Dave Rubin were like, Operation Warp Speed sucks. And it's like, yeah, but like, I don't remember you saying that like 2 years ago when it mattered. So then it became this proxy war of the DeSantisers versus the Trumpers being so petty towards each other, like doing personal attacks. And I was like, what are we, 5 years old? Like, dude, it's at the point now where like I do news analysis. I like hip hop music. I do other stuff. I really don't like politics. Like, I like talking about it and being honest, but like whatever these people are doing, like that's not me. And it weirds me out tangling with these people, because it's like, yeah, it was like 3 years of just insane delusion from almost everyone.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is that like DeSantis, well, obviously was not perfect, but he was so much better than almost everybody, almost every other governor on COVID, and
Right,
like when he turned around, he did turn around, and he did it at a point where it did take real courage to do. And like, he stood down the world, but then he's running for president, and he refuses to say that he won't support the war in Ukraine, and he's gung-ho on supporting Israel's war in Gaza. So it's kind of like, I don't even, there was like no interest, like COVID's over and you're not even good on the issues of the day. But then Trump, to have the nerve to start attacking DeSantis about his COVID track record. And you're like, gee, and I got to say, man, that this is one of the things that, and I guess, look, I got enough of them who listen to me, because like, I guess like I tell the truth about enough of the things that they care about telling the truth about. Like, like I'll prosecute the case pretty effectively that like Donald Trump was framed for treason by his own intelligence agencies, you know what I mean? And that he was like, they quite literally framed for treason, and other things like that. But it really is unbelievable how much the Trump supporters will stick their heads in the sand and just yell, nah, 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 whenever it comes to any of his COVID track record. Because like they will, almost all of the Trump supporters would 100% agree with me and you on the issues at this point. So like if I were to say to you, hey, COVID lockdowns were terrible, school closures were a disaster for children, Fauci never should have been on the COVID task force, the vaccine didn't do what they claimed it did. Like you go down the list, they'd agree with us on every one of these points. And then you go, okay, so Trump was the president of the United States while all of this was happening and okaying all of it. And then it's like, well, they lied to him, well, they did this, well, they did that. And it's just excuse after excuse. And you're like, really, dude? There's no accountability for the worst year in modern American history being on his watch. Nothing. You can't muster up any blame for the guy who, by the way, his promise was winning. His promise was, you're going to be sick of winning once I'm in there. And there's just, I just find that to be like pathetic. Like for your own, as an adult, you can't make the many excuses for another man who got something so profoundly wrong.
Right. I'll point out that he hired 2 pharmaceutical executive lobbyists for HHS and FDA, took $1 million from Pfizer, essentially he said he'd never take money, and he did take money. And people will be like, oh, you're being so hateful. And it's so funny because like, I'm not saying I've never made a mistake, but I look at like the competition in right-wing media. There's a lot of them are pretty angry. I'm not mad at them. I'm just saying it's like, oh my God, like they're always yelling and stuff. I'm like, I'm hateful. Did you hear what I just said? It was literally factually accurate, but it sounds like hate speech to people that like worship Trump and think he's going to do everything. And dude, it was so diabolical, his DeSantis strategy, which actually worked. But I think he did like the muddying the water strategy. the one thing that DeSantis had over Trump by a long shot was his COVID policy. Was DeSantis perfect? No. He turned the corner early. He talked about it for years, and Trump ran around saying that he basically saved the world with Operation Warp Speed. It's not even debatable, even though DeSantis did mess up, and it's okay to point it out. So I think Trump, his campaign was like, let's just pretend like we did the exact same thing, and then nobody will realize if I say it enough. And it worked. And here's an even more messed up part is Gavin Newsom did that in the debate with DeSantis. He tried to wash it and say, oh, it's just a wash. We all did the same thing. And Gavin Newsom was the worst governor in the country on COVID. But here's how smart Gavin Newsom is and how he played Trump supporters. He says that Trump supporters hated DeSantis at the time. So they actually started sharing that clip and saying that Newsom owned DeSantis. And it's like, no, Newsom's lying through his teeth. Like DeSantis made $1 trillion go, and other states too eventually, but DeSantis really led it, I think, on a national scale. $1 trillion were lost by New York and California, and it was that had to turn the corner for them. That's the only reason they stopped doing this, is they were losing so much, and they were losing because of governors who were open, DeSantis being one of them. So it's like, to let Gavin Newsom off the hook and try to act like it was just a wash. You messed up, I messed up. What's the difference? Dude, I could write a book on the difference. Tom Woods did apparently, but I might do it too.
Dude, it's I mean, look, if you want to, the most simple test for any of this stuff is like how people vote with their feet. You know, there's, if you want to sit here and if somebody wanted to say to you, you know, Central and South America is a much better place to live than the United States of America. Well, what would be the obvious counter to that? You would be like, well, then how come people are flooding in here from there and there aren't people flooding in there from here? And so just to get down to all this stuff, well, where were people moving to during the COVID years? Were they flooding into California and New York? Or no, they were flooding out by the hundreds of thousands, and they were going to Florida and later Texas. And yeah, that's just it. And you know, when Trump would share the thing which he did, which is such a dirty, dishonest trick, where he would just share the raw data and say that Florida did worse than California with COVID deaths. And you're like, yeah, until you adjust for age.
Right.
And then they did way better than them. And you're like, if you don't adjust for age with COVID, it is ridiculous. The only people who were dying were old people. I mean, almost exclusively old people. Like, go look at a chart of who dies from COVID. It's like overwhelmingly very old, very sick people. So if you don't adjust for that, it's like on the level of when the feminists say there's a wage gap and you go, you didn't even control for hours worked. You didn't even control for how, like, whether this was a full-time job or not. This is insane.
Did you see the clip where Trump goes, you know, the only reason Florida did well during COVID is because it was warm weather. Warm weather and beaches, turns out, not that hard to run. He's like, Charlie Crist, the Democrat, did just as good of a job. There's really no difference. And it's like, bro, California proves that theory wrong economically and COVID-wise. Like, warm weather didn't allow it to be run properly, obviously. So, like, he put that stuff out. And, dude, I'm looking around to all my other peers, and I'm like, is anyone going to tell the truth about this? Like, it's almost helped me out because it makes me stand out, where it's like some people are like, oh, he turned so hateful. Dude, this is like if you're such a psychopath or a liar that you're willing to act like that's true, like, what else are you going to lie about? And then another one was he put out this email, or his team did, where he just goes down how bad Florida is. Keep in mind, Trump ran to Florida from New York to stop being prosecuted by the psycho Democrats. And then he's putting out these weird, I think it was like somethingwallet.com, some like weird fringe website that's not even that popular, but it's like, Florida's one of the worst places to live, one of the worst places to retire. It's one of the worst places for police officers. It's one of the worst, like, had a list of how bad Florida was. And it's like, bro, people in Florida don't feel that way. Like, they might not love everything about it, but like, everybody wants to go to Florida. The weather's good and it's like pretty economically sound. And Trump's out here just firing off a list of, I think he said it's the worst place to like be a doctor, worst place. Like, it's so bad you went there. Like, if I said, you know, I wouldn't say like San Francisco's the worst, you know, city in the world and then move there. Like,
right.
You know,
Yeah.
like, it's crazy.
It's, you know, it's as simple as the fact that when you're getting in between Donald Trump and what he wants, he's just going to try to destroy you. And then, you know, DeSantis, just on top of like his bad foreign policy and stuff like that, he just did not have the it factor to run a successful presidential campaign. I mean, he really, God, if there's one decision that one politician regrets, how much does DeSantis regret running for president? I mean, to go from being like the GOP gubernatorial star, the guy who took a purple state and made it a 20-point deep red state, you know,
Right.
and then just to go humiliate yourself with these like weird lift shoes and the weird smile. That you remember the smile? Like at every debate, he'd have this like thing that he'd like look up and do, and you're like, "What are you, dude? What are you doing, man? Stop!"
He kind of
You
acts
don't have
like
anyone around you who told you to stop making that face.
he kind of acts like a little autistic or something, or like he's just like
Yeah.
a little nerdy. But yeah, I think two things really hurt him. One, out of his control, was like the Alvin Bragg thing. I remember everyone liked DeSantis until the Alvin Bragg arrest,
Yep.
and like patriots like rewired their brain. They're like, "We need Trump." I was like, "Wait, you didn't want him a week ago again?" They're like, "Because of the revenge." And I was like, "Oh gosh," you know. And then, but then also to take accountability. Yeah, I don't know. He doesn't have like he makes sense when he talks a lot, but he doesn't have like a really thick personality. And Trump is like a huge like bully, and he's really good at it, and he's really funny. And like DeSantis did not have the antidote to combat that. Trump, in many cases, was just making stuff up. Florida, it's just warm. That's why it was good.
Yeah,
It's not even true, but like DeSantis couldn't even handle it. And like I wonder if DeSantis had a better personality and really could combat it. I wonder even then, making no excuses for him because he did mess up. I wonder if he could have beat Trump, because like the Trump support once Trump got arrested, it's like,
I think probably once the deep state made it official that they're trying to ruin Donald Trump's life and take away his freedom, I don't think anyone was going to beat him. You know, Donald Trump has this enormous advantage politically. That is that he is the star of the movie. He's the star of everybody's movie.
Right.
Even the people who hate him, he's still the star of their movie. You know, like it's like he's just the star. The whole movie to them is about the threat to democracy is this guy Donald Trump rising up and taking it. And to the Trump supporters, the whole movie is this hero of the working man who's gonna make America great again. And he already by his nature, he sucks the oxygen out of every room, and you're just all focused on him. I mean, look, he's so goddamn hysterical. He's so entertaining. I just watching him speak, it's always fun. He's always doing something that makes you laugh, and that's a big advantage for him. And the problem with Donald Trump is just that he's not any of the things that the left projects onto him. He's not Hitler. He's not a racist. He's not like any of these. He's not any of the things that the right wingers project onto him. He's not like a conservative. He's not the champion of the people, or he is what you see. He's just Trump. He's never read a book about anything. He's literally has never read a book. He doesn't know
Is that
anything.
what he said?
I'm just saying he's never read a book. He's not, everything he knows he learned from a show. You know what I mean? Like everything, it's just he is 1 centimeter deep. It's all just run off instinct. And his biggest primary driver is how terrific he is and how great he is. And the biggest thing that motivates him is that they say he lost, but they say I lost, but I really won. I won tremendous, and we're going to win this next time. We're going to win big. But then once he gets in there, it's like, what can you actually count on him to do?
Dave.
I love now all these Trump supporters tell me, no, Dave, he's figured it out. Now he knows all the good people to a point.
I read the Bible front to back. I love the whole thing. The Bible is great. Christians.
Where they said to him once, they asked him what was his favorite book in the Bible, and he said like, oh, there's different books.
I think he said he likes the whole thing, and then
goes, I like it. I like them all. They're all so great.
they asked if Frank Luntz asked if he ever asked God for forgiveness, and he like went on this rant about some pastor he likes, and like totally just didn't like Trumpy, like he's like, this guy's great, it's really about the present moment, whatever. And like it's like, okay, but like the question, like, have you ever asked God for forgiveness? And he's like, I don't think so. I don't look at it that way. It's like, it's hilarious. But with him being the star, it's so true. I'm kind of disappointed in RFK for a multitude of reasons. I feel like he ran an outsider campaign. Well, first he was going to do it in the Democratic Party, which was an interesting theory if he could like one up Biden. Then he went independent. Then he kind of caved on multiple issues, or at least one big issue that everyone really cares about that could have got him millions of votes. And that's what I'm wondering is like, what do you think his intentions are of running? Like maybe he's just trying to spread his message, but Trump is a star. He's running independent. Democrats, most of them are going to vote for Biden because they just want to beat Trump, the villain in their movie. Like, what is RFK doing? If he would have waited 4 years since he's running with Democrat donors, he could have been the Democratic nominee and had a chance. I almost feel like he's having a DeSantis moment where he's kind of like picking a bad time to run. And I don't know what he's trying to accomplish, because as much as I like his pharmaceutical stuff, I just think he has no chance, and it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I told him in a phone call, I told him this much when he was first talking about leaving the Democratic Party, and I urged him not to. I thought his campaign at the beginning was so much more fascinating to me than it is now, because at the beginning he's running as a Democrat in a primary challenge, and he's running off a repudiation. I should say he's running on a repudiation of Joe Biden's top two positions, which at the time, right, we're going back to the summer of last year now. At the time, it was number one, Joe Biden's first year in office was get this jab in as many arms as we possibly can and use any amount of force that we possibly can to do it. Now, he was successful in some of that and unsuccessful in some of it. Like for his OSHA mandate got struck down by the Supreme Court and stuff, but he was going to insist that every single business with 100 or more employees had to be fully vaccinated. Everyone loses their job. I mean, luckily that was struck down. But so he was all in on the vaccine. And then his next policy starting in 2022 was all in on funding the war in Ukraine. And then here you have this Democratic challenger who is a complete repudiation of both of those policies. And he's he's Bobby Kennedy's kid. You know, he's like from Democratic royalty in this very profound way, giving every Democrat in America permission to not have to go along with this. You can keep your identity and reject these policies because look, and he wasn't like some peripheral Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy's kid, you know, like right directly in line. And so it was so interesting to me. I thought that was his role. His role was supposed to be like what Ron Paul was for Republicans, saying you can be anti-war and still be a conservative Republican. You can, you know what I mean? Once he went independent, it changed all of that, because you're not an independent, you're a Democrat. You're a Kennedy. You have to be a Democrat, you know? And then, of course, you know, the big thing was as you mentioned, is the war in Gaza. And as you kind of alluded to, you know, you said an issue that could have gotten him millions of more supporters, but just really run that counterfactual through. Like, what if he had come out and been the only one who was good on the issue, and the only one who was saying that, like, no, America is not going to bankroll you, Israel, and our role in all of these conflicts, if America is to have any role in the world, is that we're here to negotiate peace whenever you guys are ready. Like, if Zelensky and Putin want to sit down in a room, we will facilitate that room for you guys to sit down in. And same thing with the Israelis and the Palestinians. And if he had done that, if RFK had run on that, if he was as good as he is on Ukraine, on the war in Israel, I mean, 50% of Democratic voters right now are calling it a genocide. He could have stolen millions and millions of Joe Biden's votes, and probably taken a lot of America First type votes too, from Donald Trump. I mean, he actually may have been able to win this thing if he had been good on this one issue. And so there's something tragic about it.
On that note, you know, I think in the Democratic Party, especially among the youth, but it's like most of them are on the Palestine side, and they don't look favorably to Israel. In the Republican Party, I feel like it's very split, but I think there's been a concerted effort to make it seem like Ben Shapiro's take is really popular, but I don't think it has been, and I think it just keeps getting less popular. And now you're starting to see that on X and even Instagram and social media, where it wasn't that way a couple of years ago. There's a concerted effort to act like that's not how a lot of people feel, but it is. So that's what, like, some people say, oh, well, RFK is just running to take votes from Democrats. He's just lost tens of millions of votes doing that. If he was playing this game theory thing where he's just kind of playing along to take votes, then he wouldn't have taken that opinion if that's what he's doing. with what you say, I've said this 100 times, like to my audience, and I'm glad you feel the same way. It's always nice when someone agrees with you, but yeah, I'm not interested in this campaign anymore for a multitude of reasons. One of them being him running as a Democrat was how he started. Running independent, I think he's going to take more votes from Trump than Biden at this point, unless a bunch of Democrat boomers really like the Kennedy name. That's hard for me to really understand, like where they're running their ads. And it's like you're running independent with this big Democrat donor. If you're going to do the big Democrat donor thing, just run in the Democratic Party. And if this isn't the right election to do it, who's the Democrat in 4 years? RFK is the most popular. I bet you he could get millions of people to switch their registrations just to vote for him. So it's like, I feel like he kind of fumbled the bag here. And I just wonder what his intentions are. Only he knows, but I'm like, you're not going to win this election. I don't think he's even going to come close. The question is, who is he going to take votes away from? And maybe he doesn't care. And I wanted to run this by you real quick, because this is my thought for the Libertarian Party. In Europe, if you get 5% of the vote, you get 5% of the representation, and you get to leverage in these like little circular rooms, like, leverage your support with both sides. And I kind of like that. I don't want America to be that way, but I think it's an interesting game. In America, you either win or lose, and then you get to play that game, but it's mostly Republicans and Democrats. I think the libertarians and people like RFK could be successful if they were just self-aware. Like RFK said, listen, I got 10 to 20% of the vote. Not going to win, but I will steal the election. So he could go to Biden or Trump and say, listen, make me the head of the HHS. Make me the head of the FDA. Let me do everything I can to clean up Monsanto and all these pesticides and all this pharmaceutical stuff. If you do, I'll tell all my people to vote for you. I'll drop out. And because I do think if RFK did that under a Trump or Biden administration, it could potentially help the country more than any president ever has. Because I feel like it's such a root level important issue, like the food we're eating, the water we're drinking. RFK is a master at that. He understands it completely. Why not go to Trump and try to make that deal? Then Trump could win by 10 points. You actually do something, and you'll be probably one of the only good people in his cabinet, because I foresee him hiring a bunch of swampers anyway. So it's like, I don't understand why RFK doesn't do that. And if libertarians could leverage their 10% of the vote in certain states or in certain elections and say, listen, I'll run and screw this whole election up unless you end this foreign war, at least unless you do something for Americans that's libertarian. I think it's a good strategy.
I 100% agree with that strategy. Obviously, there's like it's always a situational, so you always have to judge like who is the candidate and who, like how bad they are. And I do think there's situations where both the candidates are so bad that it's like just unworkable. If Lindsey Graham is running against some awful Democrat, it's like it's just screw both of them. We can't make any type of deal. But I do think, particularly on statewide races, and I've been advocating this for years now, that what libertarians should be doing, the Libertarian Party, under the current uniparty status quo that we live in now, is that what you want to do is, particularly in races where you're polling above the margin, which that is something libertarians do fairly often, where there'll be like, a 2-point difference between the Democrat and the Republican, and the libertarian is polling at 4%. They're polling more than the margin of error. That that what you should be doing is extorting, particularly with incumbents, if you can
legally, like a legal negotiation.
Yes,
like
to just
negotiate.
We will. Yes, that's what I mean.
The
like,
negotiation. Yeah, no, extorting sounds like crazy.
Yeah,
it's a word.
There's a negative connotation with that word, sure. But I think that you should be going and saying, listen, we will spoil this for you unless you give us these demands, and make them reasonable demands. Even at that, make them things that, like, you're not going to come to some Republican and say, you got to legalize heroin or something like that. And he's going to be like, look, there's no way I can legalize heroin. And go, yeah, but like you should promote concealed carry rights or something like that. That's like, yeah, this is the most Republican thing to do. Be really good on guns, be really good on war, be really good on taxes, be really good on. And so, yeah, I completely agree with that. When it comes, the issue you have when you're not doing it with incumbents, it's still probably worth doing in some places. But there's one of the real problems with politics is that whatever concessions you're able to extrapolate from a candidate, those are just promises. And what if What do politicians do about promises? You know, the problem with politics in general is that as soon as you're sworn in, all of your incentives are not to keep your promises to your constituency. All of the incentives become to please lobbyists, to play ball with, you know, other politicians, other foreign governments and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, I'm with Trump. It's like who his cabinet is if he does win. That's going to show me right away. Like I've learned that lesson. Like who does he hire for Secretary of State? That's what his foreign policy is going to be like, unless he fires them, you know, and then hires someone else. Trump likes a good little hire.
But it'll still tell you a lot immediately, you know, if he does get back in there, like who he puts around him, because you cannot overstate how awful all of his appointments were, or damn near all of them. I mean, so many that they're so bad. I mean, like, you know, John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. And look, the guy was last time in his 70s and he picked Mike Pence to be his vice president.
Do you know who Trump picked for Secretary of Transportation? Because right wingers are always bashing Pete Buttigieg for being that under Biden.
I can't remember.
Trump picked Mitch McConnell's wife, and she ran it all 4 years, and no one knows that. But it's like, yeah, Pete Buttigieg is not deserving, but like that's so like Trump's like Mitch McConnell. So it's like he put his wife as the Secretary of Transportation, and I have to sit here and pretend like only Biden does these things, you know?
Yeah. Just all up and down. I mean, Wray is the FBI director, was a Trump appointee. It was horrible.
I appreciate your time. Before we end it, I just wanted to ask real quick, like, I know that you're a comedian. Like, at what point did you start talking about politics and podcasting and kind of hitting that circuit? Was there a certain year that you decided that you were doing it?
So I started stand-up comedy in 2006, and I wasn't really political at all. I mean, I was like a little bit. Like 9/11, I was a New Yorker, and I was here in New York. I'm in Jersey now. I was there during 9/11, and in the years after 9/11, I grew to really hate George W. Bush. Like I really hated him, and I totally thought he was like just ruining the country. So I was right about that. But I wasn't like very politically aware. I didn't really know anything. And then it was in 2008. That the Ron Paul campaigns, I just saw him in the debates and I was just really interested, and I just like fell down this rabbit hole of like obsessively reading everything I could get my hands on, starting with all of Ron Paul's stuff and then like all of his intellectual like influences, and then just got obsessed with this whole world. And so during that process, I had been doing stand-up comedy the whole time. And then like that just started having an influence on my comedy, because, you know, whatever you're obsessing over is what you're going to end up talking about. And then it was like in the following years after that, it was like podcasting just became big. And then there's really two people, Louis J. Gomez, who's a very funny comedian, one of my best friends, and Nate Bargatze, who's another hilarious comedian, one of my best friends. And the two of them were always like, dude, you have all this interesting stuff to say. You got to just start a podcast and start doing it. And I almost started the podcast. It was almost like a form of therapy or something like that. Like I was just like, well, I got all this stuff and I got to rant about this, and whoever wants to listen to it can listen to it. And then just over the years, it grew and grew, and, you know, the audience got bigger and stuff. But yeah, and it just, at the time, I wasn't making any money on any of it. I just loved doing all of it. So I was just doing all of it and being broke. And then, then the audience grew, and I started making money off of it, and it turned into a career. But I'm very, very fortunate and blessed. Like I genuinely love what I do. And I think that in many ways, that's, if you could figure out how to do something that you love, I think you've kind of beat the system in a way. So I'm very lucky.
What year did you start podcasting? Do you remember?
I started, I believe it was 2012.
That's early for podcast.
Yeah. I started doing it there, and then I think I got discouraged and stopped for a little bit, and then came back in 2013 and started doing it. And then I've been doing it ever since then. And then it was in 2016, so I'd been doing it for like 3 years at this point, and in 2016 I did the Joe Rogan Experience for the first time, and then that really had a bit, like I got a big bump off of that, and then it's just kind of been growing since then.
Well, I appreciate your time. Thanks for the convo. It's been overdue, and it's been a pleasure. So where can people find you, your channel, everything? We'll give it a plug.
Comic Dave Smith on Twitter. I forget this is how good I am at this, but it's Part of the Problem is the name of my podcast. It's up everywhere. And comicdavesmith.com is my website, and that has like all my touring dates and stuff like that if you want to come out and see a show.
Sweet. Well, thanks everybody for listening. And sorry, I didn't look at the chat the whole time. I don't know if people super chat or stuff, but I wanted to pay attention to what I was talking about and not like read a bunch of comments because it would have thrown me off. And I'm glad I did. So I apologize if I missed a bunch of super chats. Like I just wanted to be in the present and not like scrambling the whole time, because I feel like I look real shifty too when I do that. People like my eyes are shifting all over the place, but I'm producing the show. So yeah, it's been great. Thanks a lot. Appreciate you.
Thank you, my brother. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Talk to you guys soon. Thanks for being here. Hey, what's going on, my friends? Just a few ways to stay in touch and support if you'd like to. The first way is dreamrare.com. We have blue beanies, black beanies, pink hats, other colored hats, freedom versus tyranny shirts, Stay Blessed long sleeve, God is Great long sleeve, and lots of more cool items coming soon. Dreamrare.com. Check out the shop to support. Everything's made in the United States. Handpicked by me. Patreon.com/raretalk for $5 a month. You can help support me, support the show. If you haven't noticed, unlike other channels, I don't work with very many sponsors, sometimes none at all. And part of the way I'm able to do that is with the dreamrare.com shop and patreon.com/raretalk. So thank you guys for keeping this show free, unimpeded, uninterrupted. I'm forever grateful. My free email list is stayintouchwithme.com. So check the links below in the description or just type in on any browser, stayintouchwithme.com, all one word. You'll find my email list, put it in there, and it's the least annoying email list you'll ever be on. I barely use it.